Hello, everyone. I'm Dan Schlesinger, the chairman of the Board of Governors at Hebrew University, and it's my pleasure to introduce and welcome you to this special program on the Israeli economy in the shadow of war. Before we begin, I think it's incumbent on all of us to note that today marks 5 months to the day since the attack in southern Israel on October 7th. And in particular, I think we need to keep in mind, keep in our thoughts, the 134 hostages who are still being held in Gaza, including our Hebrew University student Karnit and the son of Professor Jonathan Dekel-Chen. The hostage families are being welcomed to the State of the Union address by President Biden this evening. And we anticipate that some of the Dekel-Chen family will be there. So please watch out for them. At Hebrew University, classes have been proceeding for 2 months. Things are going generally pretty well, trying to be as normal as possible. But of course, the impact of the war, of the attack, is still being felt significantly. Personally, on behalf of the Board of Governors, I'd like to thank all of you who have generously given to our We Are One campaign. It's vital to provide support for the university community, for the people who are in great need in lots of respects, but including financially. And your financial support has been great. We hope it can continue. It's still very much needed. Now, to come to our program. In general, I think we all know a good amount about what's happened starting on October 7th. And since then, in terms of the physical impact on the state of Israel. But most of us don't know a lot about the impact on the Israeli economy, both short and long term. And I can think of no one better than our two speakers here today to brief us on that, to educate us on what the impact has been and will continue to be on the Israeli economy. Our speaker, Professor Karnit Flug, has been on the faculty of the Hebrew University since 2019. She formerly served a 5-year term as the governor of the Bank of Israel. Before that, she was the chief economist. She is a vice president of research at the Israel Democracy Institute. She has both her bachelor's and master's degrees from the Hebrew University, as well as her doctorate from Columbia. Also speaking today is Professor Eugene Kandel. Professor Kandel has been on our faculty since 1997. He likewise received both his bachelor's and master's from the Hebrew University and his MBA and doctorate from one of my homes at the University of Chicago. He is chair of the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. He is chair of Rise Israel, which many of us know by its previous name, Startup Nation Policy Institute, and as knowledgeable as anyone on the Israeli economy, and particularly the financial aspects of that. Last thing I want to say is, please, we do expect to have some time for questions after the speakers are done. So please use the chat function to put your questions into the chat, and then we could get to those after our speakers. And with that, let me turn it over to Karnit and Eugene.
Thank you, Daniel. And good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. And let me start immediately talking about the Israeli economy. And I'll start with a few words about the state of the economy just before the war. And if we look at the state of the economy before the war, we actually see a remarkable recovery from COVID-19. You can see here always Israel in blue, and the growth rate of the economy following COVID-19 was very, very high, 7.6% in 2021, 4.4% in 2022, much higher than most advanced economies. When we look at actually the long trend of the economy, the long-term trend of the economy, you can see also that the GDP was higher than the long-term trend, and you can see the decline during COVID, but you can actually see the remarkable recovery after that. And just before the war, we were at a level of GDP which was higher than actually the long-term trend would have predicted. The labor market was quite tight. We were at the lowest unemployment rate since the last 20 years, with very high rate of participation. So people were joining the labor market and were absorbed in the labor market by the booming demand. And generally, I would say that the economy has exhibited strength and resilience over the last 15 or 20 years, mostly due to some very basic attributes of resilience, including relatively low public debt. 60% of GDP is quite low in advanced economy standards. A continuous surplus in the current account of the balance of payments, a surplus of assets over liabilities in foreign exchange. All of these things mean that the economy is resilient to external shocks. Very large foreign exchange reserves held by the Bank of Israel. A very stable and strong and solid banking system and financial system in general, and an extremely innovative and dynamic tech sector that actually helped the economy recover also from COVID. All of these attributes actually facilitated the recovery from COVID, but also from previous rounds of violence. And if we look at how the economy recovered previously from shocks, we can see that when we look at previous rounds of violence, like the Second Lebanon War or the Operation Cast Lead and several other rounds of violence in Gaza, you can see that there was usually a decline of activity for one quarter, but then a very rapid recovery following that. We also recovered remarkably well from the global financial crisis and also from COVID. So these basic attributes, which are part of the strengths of the economy, are still with us. But then the war broke. And we can now look at few indicators on how short-term early indicators show up in what happened to the economy in the first few months, or actually since the 7th of October. So the first place where you detect the effect of the war is obviously the exchange rate. Following a continuous depreciation during 2023 related to the judicial overhaul, we saw the exchange rate shoot up in the first few weeks after the war broke up. But then we've seen, with some intervention of the Bank of Israel, actually a turnaround towards strengthening of the shekel. So that's one place where we saw the immediate effect of the war. The stock exchange, the Israeli stock exchange, has also been lagging behind the performance of global indices. Usually, it's quite correlated to what's happening in the US stock exchange, but actually this divergence or the lagging behind started already in 2023 with the judicial overall, but then it intensified since October with actually a relatively negative effect of the war on the stock exchange. In terms of the effects on the real economy, one indicator is the credit card purchases, which is, these are daily data which indicate the effect of events on private consumption. And what we've seen was initially a drop in private consumption by about 25% in the first few weeks after the war. But then we've seen actually a recovery, and the level of spending right now actually exceeds the level which was the level prior to the war, but with a fairly broad range in certain areas where, for example, tourism or restaurants, the spending there is still quite low. In other areas, the spending actually has recovered and exceeded the pre-war levels. In the labor market, the first reflection of the events was for a very substantial increase in unemployment in a broad sense of people who are absent from work due to economic reasons. Actually, the unemployment, this broad concept of unemployment reached almost 10% in October, but then slowly started to decline. But in addition to that, there were also absent people for non-economic reasons because they were evacuated from the southern border or from the north, or people who are on reserve. So in the first months of the war, actually almost 20% of employees were absent from work. By January, the numbers have already declined, but there is still a substantial part of the labor force which is either on reserve or is absent because of economic reasons. The effect on various sectors was also quite pronounced in October, but in most sectors we've seen a recovery over the last 2 or 3 months, except for tourism and construction, where construction is mostly affected by the absence of workers. Our construction sector is very dependent on foreign workers and on Palestinian workers, which are not back yet. So these are the main effects sort of that we've seen in the short-term indicators, and the question is where the economy is heading looking forward. So first of all, the first piece of data which shows sort of the aggregate effect, excuse me, on the economy is the data of the national accounts that shows a contraction in the last quarter of 2023 of 19%, that's in annual terms, of output. And you can see that it's quite a substantial effect on GDP, but not quite as strong as the first quarter of COVID, where the decline was even sharper. But judging by the past, we expect to see a recovery, However, there is a wide range of projections as to the strengths of the recovery. You can see here in the mid-section of this graph, various projections for the growth rate of the economy for 2024. You see Moody's being most pessimistic, expecting the economy to actually contract by 1.5%. And the other, or the domestic, those who make projections like the Bank of Israel or the Ministry of Finance is expecting a growth rate between 1.5% and 2%. The main uncertainty lies around the question of what happens in the north. If the northern border actually things flare up and a full-scale war, it deteriorates into a full-scale war, then I think the effect on the economy, which will be very pronounced, and that's basically what's behind the projections by Moody's. Other projections expect a recovery, assuming that the current intensity of the war in Gaza remains and actually slowly subsides, and that the southern border doesn't deteriorate into a full-fledged war. All those who are actually making these projections expect that by 2025 we will see a recovery of the economy. A few words about the macroeconomic policy that is trying to deal with the current crisis. I would say that the steps taken by the Bank of Israel were actually quite wide in order to support the economy, to support small businesses in terms of alleviating the terms of credit, and also support for households which were directly affected by the war by, for example, allowing them to delay mortgage payments and so on. A lot of these measures, by the way, were taken by the Bank of Israel also during COVID, so there was quite a lot of practice in taking these extraordinary measures in the credit market, and monetary policy also tried to make sure that market stabilizing, mostly by suggesting the sale of $30 billion in the foreign exchange market in order to calm the market, which initially reacted quite strongly. In terms of fiscal policy, obviously the war implies very substantial costs in terms of ammunition and in terms of payment to people on reserve. So the total spending rose by almost 70 billion shekels. The slowdown in the economy implied a sharp decline in tax receipts, and that put together means that the deficit is going to shoot up to 6.6% of GDP, and that will have to be financed basically by issuing debt. And that's actually the challenge right now for the government. In fact, just yesterday there was a very substantial issuance of government debt, and that was actually quite successful. So these are sort of the short-term challenges, and the question is, when we look ahead, the economy or the economic policymakers have to take into account both the short-term challenges, which I just described, including return to fiscal sustainability after this very sharp increase in government debt, a challenge of supporting the recovery of the economy, rehabilitating the affected populations, and bringing inflation back down. But we should also remember that Israel faced some long-term challenges that are still with us, and they include a productivity gap vis-a-vis advanced economies, a very substantial inequality among different populations. There are some populations that are not engaged sufficiently in the labor market, and we have a very high cost of living. So these challenges are still with us. And that means that when we think about policies ahead, we should think of basic principles that will help us recover from the current crisis, but also tackle the long-term challenges. And that means that we will have to bring back gradually the debt to GDP ratio to around 60% by keeping spending, growing spending at a moderate pace. We will also have within the budget to make sure that we support the engines of growth, and we support the populations and businesses that were directly affected by the war. We will need to increase our defense spending, that's clear, but it will be important after an initial increase to start bringing it back to more sustainable levels. And we will have to take into account also some basic constraints, including the need to reduce debt to GDP ratio back to sustainable levels. We will need to make a thorough study of how to increase this defense spending and how to later on reduce it back to more sustainable levels. And all of this will need to be financed by some increase in taxes, but we have to make sure that the tax increase will not erode our competitiveness, because we compete on people and on capital, and we have to make sure that the tax rates don't interfere with our competitiveness. I think in order to save time, I will stop here. Thank you, and I'll pass on the stick to Eugene.
Hi, it's a pleasure and honor to be here. I've been at Hebrew University for the last 27 years, and prior to that, a long time as a student. So I have a very strong attachment to the school. I will just share my screen, and I want to connect to what Karnit was talking about. And I want to talk about actually long term and the structural issues that Israel has to address in order to make the country resilient. And I just want to briefly repeat what Karnit said about the lost decade in 1973, which was essentially a knee-jerk reaction. We were surprised, we were taken, we were ambushed, and the response was to spend 30+% of GDP on defense. Today, our entire budget is about 30% of GDP. So it basically says that if we were like this today, we had no medicine, no education, nothing, just defense, which of course is not likely. So this is a one-time large expense, the war, maybe even 200 billion shekels or even more. And this is a very, very painful, but remember that our economy is very, very different from the economy in 1973. And So we may end up with about 10% of GDP after some USA then catch up in growth that Karnit talked about. But it's still very, very painful. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? Because 10% of GDP, if we increase the GDP, it'll sort of dissipate into it. But if we don't, then it's going to be quite painful to repay this. But then there is also a permanent increase in the defense expenditure, not just the war, but some that the war like this doesn't happen, or God forbid, if we have a war in the north, that is going to be much larger expenditures. So we need to figure out how to connect the defense expenditure to the GDP and maybe the idea that was resisted before, but maybe it's time for it to link the defense expenditure as a percentage of GDP that starts a bit higher than today, maybe, I don't know, 7.5%, but then it declines steadily over the next 10 years. That has to be a plan. So the bottom line is today a lot of people talking about where we need to cut budgets, and it's a serious issue. But I think the bigger issue is how to make the economy grow. That is Karnit made this point as well. But I would make it an even bigger issue, which the growth is a part of it. Is that how do we make Israel a resilient country, the country that is resilient to shocks? And you know, the shock that we experienced on October 7th, as horrific and as painful it is, and it continues with the hostages and with the war, it is not the only shock that we're going to experience, because we're going to experience geopolitical shocks, whether it's China, Russia, our local area, whether it's BDS. We're going to see more and more of those. We're going to experience tech shocks, whether it's AI, quantum computing, a completely new tech, which may actually create various disadvantages to what we do already. There are economic shocks, increased competition, technological unemployment around the world. You know, John Maynard Keynes was worried about technology replacing people at a very fast rate, so the unemployment will be endemic. That was in 1930. He was dead wrong. But maybe he was not wrong about the technological unemployment, but just about the timing. So maybe we're talking about 2030, and that may be actually something to worry about. Inflation, competition. Oh, I wrote competition twice because there's so much of it. Climate, of course, shocks that we're going to have, both in terms of mitigation, adaptation costs. It's going to be quite stressful. And there is also social unrest all over around the world. We see that in, you experience that more than we do where you live, but we also experience that in Israel. And that is, all these shocks have to be dealt with ahead of time, and Israel must be prepared to deal with them. For some shocks, Israel might be affected more than even others, because we are very, very concentrated economy. There's not much diversification. Of course, the location, you know, as you say in real estate, the main thing is location, location, location. You know, in 40 years, Moses could have found perhaps a better location. Wandering in the desert, maybe could have gotten to some other place. But we are here. And we also can benefit perhaps from these shocks if we're smart. And that's a big if. And so resilience is a broad concept that includes growth, and resilience needs to be built. It doesn't just occur naturally, even though Karnit showed that the Israeli economy is resilient, but it's resilient to some shocks, and it may not be resilient to others. So what are the necessary conditions for a resilient country? First of all, the necessary condition for resilience is a strategic and coordinated government that promotes a competitive economy, creates a cohesive society, and identifies and manages serious risks. Okay, and what I'm going to say next in the next slide has nothing to do with my political views. And that it's not a political statement. I'm talking about Israeli government as a structure. It has nothing to do which political party rules it. And what I would like to claim is that as a rule, the government of Israel, as well as many other countries, is neither of these. It's not strategic, it's not coordinated, doesn't promote competitive economy, does not necessarily promote cohesive society, and it does not manage or identifies serious risks. And there are, of course, some exceptions, but they only strengthen the rule. I'm talking about the government as a whole. And there is a problem. And sometimes people say, but look, most governments are like that. Yeah, yes, I say, but Finland, which is much more strategic and coordinated than we are, can afford to be non-strategic, because even in 100 years, it will still be Finland. Well, let's say Denmark. I don't know. Maybe Russia will invade Finland. Who knows? Sorry about if there are people here from Finland, meant no disrespect. I'm sure that you have this worry as well. But unfortunately, Israel has no luxury to basically be non-strategic and not manage risks. But there are countries that are strategic and manage risk and coordinated, whether it's Singapore, New Zealand, Denmark, Finland. There are many examples of countries that have these features. And unfortunately, there are no institutions within Israeli government that have the capacity to make these to make this happen in the future. So, for example, nobody within the government of Israel has the mandate and the responsibility and the power to ensure the competitiveness of the Israeli economy. There is no minister. There is no government official that wakes up in the morning and says, my job is to make sure that Israeli economy is competitive in the world markets. And by the way, I have the power to actually make sure that that can happen. None of that exists. There's no institutional political structure that identifies and manages risks. For example, nobody manages the risk of societal strife, which could be quite significant. In fact, all the parties, and it doesn't matter which one, are focused on winning against the others. Nobody is thinking about how not to lose as a whole. Moreover, a lot of the government, and in this case, this government in particular, did not do anything to change the structure of the government, and is focused on basically dividing the cake, and is not focused on increasing. And it will not bring either cohesive society nor competitive economy. And then we are asking a question, how can we make the country resilient if we do not work on that? So allow me to give you some sort of views on what the government that, in my opinion, Israel needs. And I'm not talking a political party that would be ruling coalition. I'm talking about the structure of the governing body that leads the country. So the first thing is it must be trust-based. And trust is an interesting thing because some people say, let's establish the trust, but it actually, the Israeli structure, the governmental structure, is built on the premise that you cannot trust anyone. In fact, whether it's about taxes, whether it's about anything else, you start a discussion within the government from the fact that you can't trust the population. By the way, the population doesn't trust the government. And despite the fact that the population relies or expects the Israeli government much more to help it than many other developed countries. And yet, the population that expects Israeli government to solve all of its problems doesn't trust its representative 5 minutes after it elects them. It doesn't trust civil servants either. In fact, there's little trust within the government, either between the three branches of the government or within them. So the problem is that every stakeholder and the government, sometimes especially the government, basically are doing transactional dealing with everybody else. Okay, so they optimize in the very short run. So when we have a collective bargaining agreement, these are collective bargainings for the next 2 years, and everybody's trying to maximize the benefits, and basically everybody feels cheated, and they are preparing to the next fight 3-4 years later. There's no thinking about how do we create something that will be stable over the next 15-20 years. And in the process, it's easy to see that we're all getting much less out of the current spending that we could have, and we exposed to many more risks, and there is no government-wide long-term strategy to build trust. It just doesn't exist. But Israel can't afford not to have a trust-based government, because Israel expects, as a country, is built on the notion that the citizens are going to contribute a lot. And there is a lot of trust between citizens, within various groups of citizens, let's say IDF, or there, you would be amazed to see what degree of voluntary contributions of time, effort, money, everything else was observed within the Israeli citizens that were not drafted, but drafted themselves and created enormous ability to get things done when the government wasn't able to. And so we do have trust base, and yet we sort of lose it when it comes to the government. And it's the interesting thing. Ernest Hemingway once said that the best way to find out whether you can trust somebody is to trust them first. Okay, that's how we start our business relationship, our personal relationship. We don't say to our potential, partner in marriage, first, I don't trust you. Let's see within the next 5 years whether you can earn my trust, and then we'll see whether we get married. That relationship probably going to last a couple of days. You trust the person, and you hope that they will reciprocate and be worthy of your trust. We have to change the paradigm. And of course, Lev Tolstoy always said that everyone wants to change the world. Nobody wants to change themselves. We do have to change themselves, give trust, and instead of blaming everybody else for not being trustworthy. There is a huge issue here, whether it's media, whether it's politician, whether it's the voters, but we definitely not going to see that coming from the politicians of any sort. The other part that we need is Israeli high-tech supplies incredible amount of very good solutions to the world, and yet we're walking barefoot. We have to create Israeli government that should be incredibly data intensive and built on large amounts of quickly processed data. We have none of that. That is absolutely essential. And then we need competent and focused government. Instead, what we do is many other countries do, but we sort of gotten this completely wrong. We choose random people who win some primaries in some country, in some parties, sorry, and then we choose the ministers who run our most important ministries based on what is the party that they came from, how many votes did it get in the Knesset. They have no experience, no knowledge about the stuff that they're supposed to do. It's not clear what their incentives are, and it's clear that most of their time is actually spent on their political needs rather than on the needs of the ministry. So we have to stop this because it satisfies the definition of crazy by Einstein. If you do the same thing all over again and expect different results, you must be crazy. And we are, in some sense, because we would not do that in any other area of our life. We would not go to a doctor that was chosen by a popularity contest, neither to a lawyer or an engineer or anybody else. And so we have to sort of change the switch. The specific proposals, I'm going to switch. We basically need to move to professional government that pays its ministers well. These ministers, we need to create sort of strong prime minister office, which coordinates strategy and risk management. And we need to attract the best talent, which we don't currently do. The other specific proposal is that we need to really rein in our regulatory agencies because they are sort of going berserk. And as many other OECD countries understood, you need to have a regulatory budget, which we don't. But the last part that may be the most relevant for this audience is that I believe that we need to give diaspora a formal voice in Israel. We probably should not have ability to elect elected representatives, but barring that, I think we need to have some kind of representation of diaspora, of various diasporas in the world, for the very simple reason. Actually, there are several reasons. First reason is that when we do something here, every diaspora feels it. Two, when we're in trouble, every diaspora comes to our help. And in fact, some of the Israeli populations help the country much, much less than the diaspora Jews. So it seems unfair not to give. But the last point, I think it's the most crucial for us, is that without the voice and maybe pressure from diaspora, we might not have enough willpower to actually solve the problems, make this country resilient, so we can celebrate our 150th birthday as a strong, independent, and prosperous country. Thank you. I don't see any questions. I
Thank you
answered two
very much.
questions. Sorry, go ahead.
We do want to ask you to write your questions in the Q&A section, but I'm going to give our chairman the benefit of being able to ask the first question.
Let me ask a personal question, which is it possible to forecast the impact on the education sector in general, and in particular, the Hebrew University? What, if anything, can we expect in the way of continued funding at the levels that we've gotten used to, or increased or decreased funding?
Karnit, you want me to take it?
I will say generally that when I look at the government budgets, in the last actually quite many years, generally civilian spending was quite modest, and spending on education and on higher education and on research has been eroding. And I'm afraid that given the limitations on the budgets or the constraints that will come from increased military spending, which we know will happen, and not only for the war, but longer term or permanent increase in defense spending, I think the constraints on the civilian spending, on civilian services, will be even more severe. And I'm worried that actually there will not be enough spending on research and on higher education. And it's important, I think Eugene alluded to that. I think if we want to ensure our long-term growth, which was very much dependent on the high-tech sector, on innovation, on human capital, I think this type of spending is crucial for our continued potential growth.
Yeah, I agree that it's absolutely essential. There has been in this budget that is being pushed through the parliament, at least in the initial stage, there was an attempt to cut the higher education budget, but we've seen this stop. We had some help was involved in that, but we didn't see it in some places. There was even some addition to bring sort of stars to Israel. That's the first time that there is a program like that. But I absolutely agree with Karnit that as demands from the military and demands from the coalition increase, unfortunately, it's too easy. This is specifically for this government. It's too easy for them to say, well, these guys don't vote for us anyway. Who cares? That's unfortunately a possibility.
Okay, well, Eugene, what you said about a mechanism for giving a voice to the diaspora brought up a lot of interesting questions. Both Maria Rubin and Roland Kluger are in favor of your proposal, it sounds like. Maria asks, how do you think that the voice can be given to the diaspora? She feels that the one thing uniting the diaspora is Israel's need to survive. Other than that, the voices within each community are very diverse. Do you have any comments to make on that?
Yeah, diverse is good, but the problem that we are facing, it's actually one of the things that unite basically anybody in Israel, no matter what political views, is that I presume that over 99% of the population, the one thing that they can unite around is that we want Israel to celebrate its 100th birthday and 150th birthday as a strong, independent, and prosperous country, secure. So around that, we have, so what Ms. Rubin is writing is actually, that's something that she can agree with the rest of Israel. Unfortunately, the rest of Israel says, yeah, that's important, but now let's start fighting so we can. My view is going to be dominant, and in the process, we might actually kill that idea. So how that can happen, I don't know, but it could be, for example, second parliament of the House, like House of Lords in the UK, where people will be chosen around from both Israel, proportionally to the entire population, Jewish population in the world, and at least you would have to get some kind of response from that house, as House of Lords in the UK doesn't have any formal power, but you listen to it because there are smart and experienced people sitting there. And the population listens to it, and you're not going to just ignore it. So there are many ways to do it. And Mr. Kluger says that the trend in the last 20 years was getting away from this, and I think that's precisely the reason why we need to go in the opposite direction. I had the privilege, together with Maxine Fosberg, to chair a committee on the relationship between the diaspora and the Israeli government. And the Israeli government, for the first time in its history, in 2020, in the middle of Corona, adopted a resolution that says that Israeli government has the responsibility to help diaspora communities, not just when they're in physical danger, but in general. So that is something that it can happen, and I think it must happen.
Okay, we have some other really interesting questions. Claudio Beller asks, what percentage of the population does not participate in the workforce? And how does that figure into your calculations of unemployment?
It's maybe imprecise question, because in Israel it's not what percentage of population you'd say. There are two groups with low participation in the labor force. One is Arab women, for very historical reasons, but if you look at the stock or the percentage of Arab women, they have very, very low participation, which is around 32, 33%. Karnit, correct me if I'm wrong. But when I joined the government in 2009, it was 23%. So on the margin, the younger women participating at huge quantities. So we are on the way to solve this problem. The Haredi man is the other group. The Haredi man is actually, there is a little bit of improvement over the last 10 years, but it's been going up and down, and it's still below 50%. The problem is that these populations have not just only low participation, but also low human capital. And our women are drastically improving their human capital. Their problem is Hebrew, but even that is improving. With respect to Haredi men, it's they're not improving their human capital, and that's one of the biggest problems that we're facing, because the Haredi population is going to double in absolute size every 15 years, and it will double in the relative size every 25 years. So in 50 years, Haredi population will be over 50% of Israeli population, including Arabs. So that's, you can't basically have half of the population participating half of the time and have very low human capital. It just doesn't work. So we have to change that. Unfortunately, the coalition is basically going the opposite direction.
Actually, in the budget allocations, in the current budget, the entire flexibility that the government has in changing the priorities of the budget, it allocated to increasing the subsidization of the educational system of the Haredim that don't actually provide core curriculum and basic preparation for the labor market. So it's really moving in the wrong direction.
Thank you. Thank you both. Nicole Adler, who you both know, has asked, in the long run, given the changes in the differing sectors of the population, how do we reduce inequality, cover extended military expenses, and provide a future for our children?
Well, I think actually...
how hedgehogs... Yeah, anyway, go ahead.
Eugene just said, given the change in the composition of the population, I think the only way would be to really provide the right incentive, both in terms of carrots and sticks, that will ensure a change in the participation, and not only in the participation in the labor market, but also getting the right skills. Otherwise, I think the economy is going to go backwards. And, when you make the projections based on the change in the composition and on the current behavior in terms of participation and productivity, you actually see a decline. So the only way is a policy, and we have not been actually successful, unfortunately, in this. There have been attempts to provide incentives for the ultra-Orthodox population to engage in the labor market, but it hasn't been sufficient. And I think the efforts in this direction must be intensified. So far, we haven't seen it.
This is a whole subject for a whole another webinar for 3-4 hours. So anybody with an appetite, we're happy to discuss that.
Okay, well, we'll just stay here then. Actually, no, we do have to wrap up. So I apologize that we can only ask one more question and then we will have to wrap up. Michelle Sniger, I hope I pronounced that correctly, is asking how much the diaspora has contributed to the rebound of the Israeli economy. Do we know how much the diaspora has sent to Israel through various channels? Through bonds and charities, and have foreign transfers helped support the Israeli economy through this time?
I would say, you know, I've spoken to many Jewish communities which asked, you know, where can we help, and we're working with the Western Negev sort of Council. I think we have to put things into perspective, right? There's probably been close to $1 billion altogether with the Drive, JFNA Drive, and other supports, maybe a bit more. But remember that Israeli economy is about $430 billion economy, and we're talking about maybe around $65 billion of bill. So we're not talking about the sheer numbers are not. And by the way, the Bank of Israel has $200 billion in its reserves. So the magnitudes are not of such cannot be really sort of moving the needle. But where the money goes and how it is spent and how can it be creating various activities and various initiatives that the government would not get to? That's how this money is very, very important, and it's much more strategic and much more agile, much more willing to take risks than the government money, and that's the advantage of philanthropy. That's its goal. It's not, you know, you can't measure philanthropy in a significantly sized country by its sheer size. That's a wrong measure.
Oh, Dan, I'm sorry, you're muted.
Thanks, Francine. I think we've reached the end of our time. I'd like to thank everyone for participating, and particularly to thank our wonderful speakers, Professor Kandel, Professor Flug, for the background, the insights that you've given us, which have been truly educational. Particularly given what our experts have said about the uncertainty of continued government funding for the educational sector, I would like to bring everybody back to what I mentioned at the start, which is our We Are One campaign. There's still something in the range of 1,000 Hebrew University students who are still called up. Now we're reaching the end of this semester. They clearly are not going to be able to, those who have not been able to participate so far are not going to be able to get credit for this semester. The university is making phenomenal efforts to make programs available, to repeat courses, to offer other alternatives to make sure that the reservists can catch up when they actually can get back to their studies. But as we all know, the demands on a Hebrew University student, many of whom, most of whom finance their own education to some degree, the demands are great. The impact of the war has been horrific on them in that respect. And so we do encourage everyone who can. Again, I thank those who have been able to contribute. I encourage everyone who can to make additional contributions, to make a first contribution. Lori has put into the chat the link that you can use to do that, and please do if you can. Again, thanks everyone. Thanks to our speakers, and be well. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.